What happens when the hunter becomes the hunted? When the very person you disrespect holds your future in their hands? Detective Sarah Williams never imagined her first day as police chief would begin with a fist to her face. But sometimes the most profound lessons come wrapped in the most painful packages. This is a story that will challenge everything you think you know about authority, respect, and justice. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The morning sun cast long shadows across Riverside City as Sarah Williams sat in her car outside the police headquarters that would soon be under her command. At 2:47, she had climbed every rung of the law enforcement ladder the hard way. Born in a housing project on the south side of Chicago, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs, Sarah had learned early that respect wasn't given. It was earned. Her mother, Dorothy Williams, had instilled in her a simple philosophy that would guide her entire career. Baby, it doesn't matter what color your skin is or what's between your legs. What matters is what's in your heart and what's in your head. You use both, and you'll go places people never thought you could go. Sarah's journey to this moment had been anything but easy. She'd started as a patrol officer in Detroit's most dangerous precincts, where bullets flew more often than conversation, and where being a black woman in uniform made her a target from all sides. Some criminals saw her as an easier mark. Some fellow officers saw her as an affirmative action hire. Sarah proved them all wrong through sheer determination and an unwavering commitment to justice. She'd worked narcotics undercover, infiltrating drug rings where one mistake meant death. She'd solved homicides that other detectives had given up on, staying up nights poring over evidence until patterns emerged that others had missed. She'd survived 3 attempts on her life, 2 internal affairs investigations that cleared her completely, and countless moments when quitting would have been easier than fighting. Her record spoke for itself. Highest arrest rate in narcotics, highest case closure rate in homicide, and 0 excessive force complaints in 22 years of service. She'd earned her bachelor's degree in criminal justice while working full-time, then her master's in public administration while raising 2 children as a single parent after her husband, also a police officer, was killed in the line of duty. Every promotion had been earned through merit, every assignment conquered through preparation and persistence. When the Riverside City Council began searching for a new police chief, Sarah's name rose to the top of candidate lists across the country. She wasn't just qualified, she was exceptional. But Riverside City's police department existed in a different world. For decades, it had operated as an insular brotherhood, where promotions were based more on connections than competence, where certain attitudes were not just tolerated but encouraged, and where the phrase, "that's how we've always done it," carried more weight than constitutional law or community relations. The department's statistics painted a troubling picture. Excessive force complaints were 3 times the national average, citizen satisfaction ratings were among the lowest in the state, and turnover among minority officers was so high that recruitment had become a constant struggle. At the center of this toxic culture was Sergeant Marcus Thompson, a man who embodied everything wrong with the old guard mentality. Thompson had grown up in Riverside when it was still a predominantly white working-class town. His father had been a police officer, as had his grandfather. For the Thompson family, law enforcement wasn't just a career, it was a birthright. Marcus had joined the force straight out of high school, in an era when psychological evaluations were cursory and diversity training consisted of a single afternoon seminar. Over his 16 years of service, he'd accumulated a file thick with citizen complaints, none of which had resulted in serious discipline, thanks to his connections within the department and the protective culture that surrounded him. Thompson's worldview was simple and inflexible. There were people who belonged and people who didn't, people who deserved respect and people who should be grateful for tolerance. In his mind, the recent push for police reform, community policing, and diversification of the force were all symptoms of a society gone soft, concessions to political correctness that undermined real law enforcement. He'd watched with growing resentment as the department slowly changed around him, as new policies were implemented and new faces appeared in supervisory roles. The appointment of a black woman as his new chief represented everything he despised about the direction his profession was heading. Thompson wasn't alone in his views. A core group of veteran officers shared his perspective, forming an informal network that had influence far beyond their official ranks. They controlled the flow of information, determined which rookies would be mentored and which would be isolated, and maintained the unwritten rules that governed daily operations. They spoke in code, using phrases like officer safety and maintaining order to justify actions that might not withstand close scrutiny. They protected each other through silence, selective memory, and an understanding that loyalty to the Brotherhood superseded all other considerations. This was the environment Sarah Williams was about to enter, though she was well aware of the challenges she faced. Her predecessor, Chief Robert Morrison, had warned her during the transition that cultural change would be her biggest obstacle. Morrison, himself a reform-minded leader, had struggled for years to modernize the department, achieving modest success in policy changes but little progress in changing hearts and minds. "You've got the credentials and the backing of the city. A council," Morrison had told her during their final meeting, "but credentials don't mean much if the rank and file won't follow your lead. Some of these guys have been doing things their way for so long, they think it's the only way." Sarah had listened politely, but she had her own ideas about how to approach the situation. She'd learned long ago that you couldn't change what you couldn't see, and that real leadership required understanding the true nature of the organization you were leading. That's why, instead of making a traditional first-day entrance with fanfare and formal introductions, she decided to conduct her own reconnaissance mission. She wanted to see her new department through the eyes of an ordinary citizen, to understand how her officers interacted with the public when they thought no one important was watching. On that fateful Monday morning, Sarah dressed in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a simple white blouse, and comfortable sneakers. She left her badge, her weapon, and any indication of her rank at home. Looking in the mirror, she saw exactly what she hoped to see: a middle-aged black woman who could be anyone, a teacher, a nurse, a secretary, someone's mother or sister. Someone who deserved to be treated with basic human dignity regardless of her occupation or status. The Riverside Police Department headquarters was an imposing brick building that had been constructed in the 1960s, its architecture reflecting the institutional mindset of its era. Wide steps led to glass doors that opened into a sterile lobby dominated by a high reception desk, behind which uniformed officers processed the daily stream of citizens who needed police services. The walls were lined with photos of fallen officers, commendation displays, and official notices, creating an atmosphere that was more intimidating than welcoming. As Sarah entered the building, she immediately noticed the dynamic she'd expected to find. The lobby was busy with typical morning activity, but there was a clear hierarchy in how different people were treated. A well-dressed white businessman was quickly directed to the detective bureau when he mentioned a burglary at his office. A young white woman reporting a stolen purse was attended to promptly and courteously, but in the corner, an elderly Hispanic man sat patiently in a plastic chair, clearly waiting for assistance that seemed perpetually delayed. Nearby, a middle-aged black woman with 2 young children spoke quietly to a uniformed officer who appeared more interested in his paperwork than her concerns about ongoing harassment by neighbors. Sarah observed these interactions for several minutes, taking mental notes about response times, body language, and the general attitude of her officers toward different members of the public. What she saw confirmed her worst fears about the department's culture. There was a clear pattern of differential treatment based on race and perceived social status, a pattern so ingrained that the officers probably weren't even conscious of it anymore. She approached the main reception desk, where a young officer named Bradley Walsh was ostensibly managing the front desk, but was actually focused on his smartphone. Walsh was typical of many new hires in departments like Riverside, young, inexperienced, and heavily influenced by the attitudes of veteran officers who served as his unofficial mentors. He'd been on the force for just 8 months, but he'd already absorbed many of the cultural norms that would shape his entire career if left unchallenged. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely, her voice carrying the professional tone she'd perfected. "Over 2 decades of law enforcement. I need to speak with someone from personnel." Walsh looked up from his phone with obvious irritation, as if Sarah's request was an unwelcome interruption to his personal time. He gave her a quick once-over, his eyes taking in her appearance and making assumptions about her purpose. "What for?" he asked, his tone suggesting that he doubted she had any legitimate reason to be there. "I have an appointment regarding employment." "Paperwork," Sarah replied, maintaining her calm demeanor despite the officer's obvious lack of professionalism. Walsh's expression shifted to barely concealed disdain. In his limited experience, civilians who came in asking about employment were usually applying for civilian positions like dispatching or clerical work, jobs that he and his colleagues considered beneath the real police work, done by sworn officers. "Employment? What kind of position?" he asked, making no effort to hide his skepticism. Before Sarah could answer, a booming voice cut through the conversation like a knife through silence. "Let me guess, cleaning staff?" The voice belonged to Sergeant Marcus Thompson, who had been observing the interaction from across the lobby with the predatory interest of someone who sensed an opportunity to demonstrate his authority. Sarah turned to face Thompson, immediately recognizing him from his personnel file, which she had studied extensively during her preparation for taking over the department. At 6'2" with broad shoulders and a muscular build maintained through regular workouts, Thompson cut an imposing figure. His uniform was immaculate, his posture military straight, and his badge polished to a high shine. But it was his eyes that told the real story, cold, calculating, and filled with a sense of superiority that had been nurtured by years of unchallenged authority. Thompson's question about cleaning staff wasn't innocent curiosity. It was a deliberate insult designed to put Sarah in what he considered her proper place. In his worldview, black women belonged in service positions, not in roles that required intelligence, authority, or respect. His smirk suggested that he found something amusing about the entire situation, as if Sarah's presence in the police station was inherently ridiculous. "Actually," Sarah replied with remarkable calm, "I'm here about an administrative position." She'd chosen her words carefully, technically accurate, but vague enough to avoid tipping her hand too early. She wanted to see how far Thompson's prejudice would take him, how deep the rot in her department really went. Thompson's laugh echoed off the marble walls and high ceilings of the lobby, a sound that was meant to be heard by everyone present. It was the laugh of someone who believed he held all the power in the situation, someone who had never been challenged and didn't expect to be now. "Administrative? Lady, do you have any idea where you are? This isn't the community center." The comment was loaded with implications that went far beyond its surface meaning. Thompson wasn't just questioning Sarah's qualifications or her understanding of the location. He was making it clear that, in his opinion, people like her belonged in community centers, social service offices, or other places where they could be properly supervised and contained, not in a police station where real authority resided. Several Officers had begun to gather around, drawn by Thompson's raised voice and the entertainment value of watching him interact with a civilian who clearly didn't know her place. Some looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking, recognizing that Thompson was crossing lines of basic professionalism. But most seemed entertained by the developing confrontation, their faces showing the kind of amused interest that people display when watching a sporting event, where the outcome is never in doubt. "I'm in the right place," Sarah said, her voice remaining steady despite the growing tension in the room. "I just need to complete some paperwork." She was giving Thompson every opportunity to correct his behavior, to demonstrate even a minimal level of professional courtesy, but she suspected he wouldn't take it. Thompson stepped closer, invading Sarah's personal space in a deliberate display of intimidation. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial level, but it was still loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. "Look," he said, his words dripping with condescension, "I don't know what gave you the idea that you belong here, but let me save you some time. We don't hire people like you for anything important." The phrase hung in the air like toxic smoke. "People like you." No further explanation was needed. Everyone in the room understood exactly what Thompson meant, and the fact that he felt comfortable saying it in front of witnesses spoke volumes about the culture he expected to continue unchallenged. Sarah felt the familiar surge of anger that had accompanied similar moments throughout her career, but her expression remained neutral. 22 years in law enforcement had taught her the value of patience, the importance of choosing battles carefully, and the power of maintaining composure in the face of provocation. She dealt with criminals, corrupt officials, and prejudiced colleagues, and she'd learned that emotional reactions rarely produced the outcomes she wanted. "I have every right to be here, Sergeant," she said, using his rank with the precision of someone who understood exactly how the hierarchy worked. The use of his rank seemed to surprise Thompson, who hadn't expected this civilian to recognize his stripes or to understand the proper forms of address. It suggested that she knew more about police procedures than he'd assumed, which made her presence even more mysterious and potentially threatening. Thompson's surprise quickly turned to renewed aggression. In his experience, civilians who knew enough to use proper ranks were usually trouble. Civil rights activists, lawyers, journalists, or other people who might cause problems for officers who preferred to operate without scrutiny. "Rights?" he laughed, but this time there was an edge to the sound that hadn't been there before. "You think you can just walk in here talking about rights? This isn't some diversity program meeting." The gathered officers chuckled nervously, but their laughter had a forced quality that suggested they were beginning to understand that this situation was escalating beyond normal bounds. A few of the younger officers looked genuinely uncomfortable with Thompson's behavior, but none of them had the courage or authority to intervene. They'd been taught that loyalty to fellow officers was paramount, and challenging a sergeant in front of civilians was a career-limiting move. "I'm simply asking to complete required documentation," Sarah repeated, her calm tone contrasting sharply with Thompson's growing aggression. She was giving him one more chance to step back from the brink, to remember his oath to serve and protect all citizens regardless of their background. "Required by who?" Thompson demanded, his voice rising as his control of the situation seemed to slip away. "Some activist group? Some federal mandate?" In his worldview, any challenge to the established order had to come from outside agitators, people who didn't understand the realities of law enforcement and wanted to impose unrealistic standards on hard-working cops. Sarah met his gaze directly, her eyes reflecting a strength and confidence that clearly unnerved him. "Required by my new employer," she said, her words carrying a weight that Thompson couldn't quite decipher but found deeply unsettling. Something in her tone must have registered, because Thompson's smirk faltered slightly. For the first time since the confrontation began, He seemed to sense that there might be more to this situation than he'd initially understood. But his pride and his prejudice wouldn't allow him to back down, especially not in front of his colleagues, who were watching every move. "Your new employer," he repeated mockingly, but there was less confidence in his voice now. "Right. And I suppose you think you're going to waltz in here and tell us how to do our jobs?" The question revealed his deepest fear, that the old ways were changing, that people he'd never had to answer to before might soon have power over him. "I'm not telling anyone anything," Sarah replied with admirable restraint. "I'm simply trying to—" But Thompson wasn't interested in hearing what she was trying to do. His worldview couldn't accommodate the possibility that she might have a legitimate reason for being there. "You're simply trying to cause trouble," he interrupted, moving even closer until he was looming over her in a clear attempt at physical intimidation. "That's what people like you do. You come in here with your attitudes and your demands, thinking you can change everything." The accusation revealed the depth of his resentment toward what he saw as unwanted social changes that threatened his position and worldview. The tension in the room was now palpable. Sarah could feel every eye on her, could sense the mixture of anticipation and anxiety among the watching officers. Some were clearly hoping Thompson would back down before he did something that couldn't be undone. Others seemed eager to see him put this uppity civilian in her place. All of them were about to witness something that would change their department forever. "Sergeant Thompson," Sarah said quietly, using his name for the first time, "I suggest you step back." The use of his name without him having provided it seemed to unnerve him further. How did this woman know who he was? What else did she know? "Are you threatening me?" Thompson snarled, his professional mask finally slipping completely away to reveal the ugly prejudices beneath. In his mind, any resistance from someone like Sarah constituted an intolerable challenge to the natural order of things. "I'm asking you to maintain professional behavior," Sarah replied, her words carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what professional behavior looked like and had the authority to demand it. Thompson's face reddened as the implications of her words sank in. Professional behavior from her. The audacity was more than he could stand. Here was a black woman, standing in his police station, daring to lecture him about professional behavior as if she had any right to judge him. "Professional?" he spat. "Let me show you professional." Without warning, his hand shot out and grabbed Sarah's arm with enough force to leave bruises. His grip was tight, possessive, designed to demonstrate his physical power over her. "Time for you to leave," he growled, beginning to pull her toward the exit like a bouncer removing an unwanted customer from a bar. Sarah didn't resist Thompson's initial grab, but she also didn't cooperate. She let him pull her a few steps toward the door while she evaluated the situation and considered her options. "Sergeant," she said with remarkable calm, "you're making a mistake." It was both a warning and a prophecy. "The only mistake," Thompson growled, his grip tightening on her arm, "is thinking you belong here." He was beyond reason now, driven by a toxic combination of prejudice, pride, and the intoxicating feeling of exercising unchecked power over someone he considered beneath him. When Sarah planted her feet and gently but firmly removed his hand from her arm, Thompson's world suddenly shifted on its axis. No one had ever resisted him like this, especially not someone he viewed as powerless. The simple act of removing his hand was more than resistance. It was rebellion against everything he believed about how the world worked. Thompson snapped. The punch came fast and hard, a right cross that caught Sarah across the jaw with the full force of his anger and frustration. The sound of knuckles connecting with flesh echoed through the suddenly silent lobby like a gunshot. Sarah stumbled backward, her heel catching the edge of a chair, but she managed to maintain her balance. One hand instinctively went to her face, but she didn't cry out, didn't collapse, didn't give Thompson the satisfaction of seeing her broken. The lobby fell into a silence so complete that the only sounds were the hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the distant chatter of police radios. Several officers looked genuinely shocked, their faces pale as they processed what they'd just witnessed. This had gone way beyond acceptable behavior, even by the department's loose standards for civilian interactions. They'd seen Thompson use excessive force before, but never so blatantly, never in front of so many witnesses, never against someone who hadn't even been accused of a crime. Thompson stood breathing heavily, his fist still clenched, apparently, as surprised by his own actions as everyone else in the room. For a moment, he seemed to realize that he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But rather than showing remorse, his expression hardened into defiance. He'd made his choice, and now he was committed to it. The silence stretched on until it was broken by the sound of an office door opening. Captain Robert Hayes, the department's personnel director, emerged from his office with a stack of files in his hands, ready to begin his routine morning briefing with the shift supervisors. Hayes was one of the few veteran officers who had embraced reform efforts, a pragmatist who understood that the department's survival depended on its ability to adapt to changing community expectations. He'd been looking forward to working with the new chief, whose reputation for integrity and innovation had preceded her. Hayes took one look at the scene before him. Sarah holding her jaw, Thompson standing with clenched fists, the circle of stunned officers, the palpable tension in the air, and his face went white. In an instant, he understood that something terrible had happened, something that would have consequences far beyond this moment. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, then louder, "what the hell happened here?" His voice cut through the silence like a blade, demanding answers that no one seemed willing to provide. Thompson started to speak, probably to offer some justification for his actions, but Hayes was already moving towards Sarah, his expression a mixture of horror and dawning recognition. As the personnel director, he'd been intimately involved in the selection and hiring process for the new chief. He'd studied her file, participated in her interviews, and recommended her appointment to the city council. Now, as he looked at her face, the professional composure, the intelligent eyes, the bearing of someone accustomed to command, he realized exactly who she was. "Chief Williams," he said, his voice barely audible, "I'm so sorry. I had no idea you were—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't find words adequate to express his shock and mortification at what had just occurred. The words hit the room like a physical force. Chief Williams. The impact was immediate and devastating. Thompson's face went through a series of color changes as the implications of Hayes's words penetrated his consciousness. The woman he'd just insulted, grabbed and punched wasn't some random civilian or job applicant. She was his new boss. She was the boss of everyone in that room. She was the person who could end his career with a single word. "No," Thompson stammered, taking an involuntary step backward, as if physical distance could somehow undo what he'd done. "That's not... She can't be." But even as he spoke the words, he could see the truth in Hayes's expression, could see the confirmation in the faces of the other officers who were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they'd witnessed. Hayes was already confirming Thompson's worst fears, pulling out an official department photograph from his files and holding it next to Sarah's face. The resemblance was unmistakable, despite the civilian clothes and the reddening mark on her jaw where Thompson's fist had connected. There was no doubt, no possibility of mistake. Sarah Williams, decorated veteran, reform advocate, and the newly appointed chief of the Riverside Police Department, had just been assaulted by one of her own sergeants on her first day on the job. Sarah straightened up slowly, her professional composure returning despite the throbbing pain in her jaw. When she spoke, her voice carried a new weight and authority that filled the room like a presence. "Sergeant Thompson," she said, each word precisely enunciated. "You're under arrest for assault on a police officer." The room erupted in chaos. Thompson began protesting wildly, his voice rising to a near shout as the reality of his situation crashed over him like a wave. "This is insane. You can't do this. I didn't know who you were. This is entrapment." But even as he spoke, two officers were already moving toward him, their faces grim with the knowledge of what they'd witnessed and what they now had to do. Officer Janet Reeves, a 10-year veteran who had often clashed with Thompson over his treatment of civilians, stepped forward with handcuffs in her hand. "Sergeant Thompson," she said with professional courtesy, "please turn around and place your hands behind your back." Her voice was steady, but there was satisfaction in her eyes as she finally had the opportunity to hold Thompson accountable for his actions. "This is insane!" Thompson shouted, his voice cracking with desperation as the handcuffs clicked into place. "I've been here 16 years. I have rights. I have a family. You can't destroy my career over a misunderstanding." The irony of him appealing to rights and due process wasn't lost on anyone present, given his earlier dismissal of Sarah's right to basic courtesy and respect. "Yes," Sarah replied with ice-cold precision. "You do have rights. The same rights you seem to think I didn't deserve a few minutes ago." Her words carried the weight of not just this incident, but decades of similar encounters she'd witnessed and experienced throughout her career. As Thompson was led away in handcuffs, his protests echoing through the corridors, the remaining officers stood in stunned silence. Some stared at Sarah with newfound respect and no small amount of fear. Others looked ashamed, embarrassed by their association with Thompson's behavior. A few seemed angry, resentful that their colleague was being held accountable for actions they viewed as justified, if not entirely appropriate. Sarah looked around the room, making eye contact with each officer present. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but carried unmistakable authority. "I want everyone who witnessed this incident to report to Captain Hayes immediately for individual interviews. You will provide complete and truthful statements about what you observed. Anyone who fails to cooperate fully or attempts to minimize or justify what happened here will face disciplinary action." The officers began to disperse, some moving quickly toward Hayes's office, others lingering as if hoping this was all a bad dream they might wake up from. Sarah remained in the center of the lobby, still holding one hand to her bruised jaw, processing the events of her first hour as police chief. Within minutes, word of the incident spread throughout the building like wildfire. Officers on patrol called in for updates. Detectives abandoned their cases to gather around radios and computer terminals, trying to piece together what had happened. The civilian staff whispered among themselves, some shocked by Thompson's actions, others amazed that he'd finally been held accountable. By noon, the story had reached the local media. By evening, it was making national headlines. The image of a newly appointed black female police chief being assaulted by one of her own officers on her first day was too powerful and symbolic to ignore. Civil rights organizations issued statements of support for Sarah and demands for comprehensive reform of the Riverside Police Department. Law enforcement unions found themselves in the awkward position of trying to defend the indefensible while maintaining their credibility. Thompson's arrest was just the beginning. As the internal investigation unfolded, a pattern of misconduct emerged that went far beyond this single incident. Officer after officer came forward with stories of Thompson's inappropriate behavior, his racist comments, his abuse of authority. Some spoke out of genuine outrage at what they'd witnessed. Others were motivated by self-preservation, eager to distance themselves from Thompson before the fallout consumed them as well. The investigation revealed that Thompson had been the subject of 17 citizen complaints over his career, ranging from excessive force to racial profiling to sexual harassment. Most had been dismissed or resulted in minimal discipline thanks to the protective culture within the department and the influence of his supporters. But now, with a new chief who had no tolerance for such behavior and the full support of the city council, every complaint was reopened and re-examined. Sarah spent her first week as chief conducting interviews, reviewing personnel files, and meeting with community leaders who had been demanding police reform for years. What she found confirmed her worst suspicions about the department's culture. Thompson wasn't an aberration. He was a product of a system that had tolerated and even rewarded his behavior. Changing that system would require more than disciplinary action against individual officers. It would require a complete cultural transformation. 3 days after the incident, Sarah held her first press conference as chief. The auditorium at City Hall was packed with reporters, community activists, city officials, and police officers. Sarah took the podium with her head held high, the bruise on her jaw still visible but fading. When she spoke, her voice was strong and clear, carrying the authority of someone who had been tested and had not broken. Some of you may be wondering if what happened in our lobby was a setup, she began, addressing the conspiracy theories that had begun circulating on social media and talk radio. It wasn't. It was simply a test, one that too many of our officers failed. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. I didn't plan to be assaulted on my first day. I didn't want to arrest one of my own sergeants before I'd even been sworn in. But I also didn't plan to pretend it didn't happen. The auditorium was silent, every person hanging on her words. What happened to me happens to citizens every day in police departments across this country. The only difference is that I had the authority to do something about it. Too many people who are treated with disrespect, who are subjected to excessive force, who are denied basic dignity by police officers, have no recourse. They file complaints that disappear into bureaucratic black holes. They tell their stories to officials who don't want to hear them. They seek justice from systems that were never designed to provide it. Sarah looked directly into the television cameras, knowing that her words were being broadcast live across the nation. Here's what's going to change in the Riverside Police Department. We're going to remember that every person who walks through our doors deserves respect, regardless of their color, their gender, their accent, their economic status, or their zip code. We're going to remember that the badge is a symbol of service, not superiority. We're going to remember that our oath is to protect and serve all citizens, not just the ones who look like us or think like us. She turned her attention to the officers. In the audience, her gaze settling on faces she recognized from personnel files and incident reports. Those of you who can't accept these principles are welcome to find employment elsewhere. Those who can accept them but need help implementing them will receive comprehensive retraining and support. And those who are already living up to these standards will help lead this transformation. The applause started slowly, building to a sustained ovation that lasted several minutes. But not everyone was clapping. Several veteran officers sat with their arms crossed, their expressions hostile. Sarah noted their faces, making mental notes about who would be her allies in the coming transformation and who would resist. Over the following weeks, Sarah implemented a comprehensive reform program that touched every aspect of department operations. She established a civilian oversight board with real authority to investigate complaints. She instituted mandatory bias training for all officers, taught by experts in implicit bias and cultural competency. She created new policies on use of force, community engagement, and officer accountability. She reorganized the command structure to promote officers who had demonstrated commitment to professional policing and community service. The changes weren't universally popular. Several veteran officers resigned rather than adapt to new expectations. Others requested transfers to departments where old-school policing was still tolerated. A few filed grievances with the police union, claiming that Sarah's reforms created a hostile work environment for traditional law enforcement approaches. But for every officer who left, 2 applied to join the reform department. Word spread throughout law enforcement circles that Riverside was becoming a model for professional policing, a place where good cops could do good work without being undermined by bad actors. Applications from qualified minority candidates increased dramatically, and for the first time in its history, the department began to truly reflect the diversity of the community it served. Thompson's case proceeded through the legal system with unprecedented speed and transparency. Despite pressure from the police union to accept a plea bargain, Sarah insisted that the case go to trial. She testified personally about the assault, describing not just the physical attack, but the pattern of disrespect and intimidation that preceded it. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Thompson was sentenced to 6 months in jail, 2 years of probation, and 200 hours of community service. In a twist that many found poetic, his community service was assigned to organizations that served the very communities he had spent his career marginalizing and oppressing. The judge noted in his sentencing remarks that police officers who abuse their authority deserve harsher punishment than ordinary citizens because they violate the public trust that is essential to effective law enforcement. 6 months after the incident, Sarah stood once again in the lobby where Thompson had assaulted her. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. The officers manning the reception desk were courteous and professional with every citizen who entered. Response. Times for all complaints had improved dramatically, regardless of the complainant's background. The hostile, intimidating environment had been replaced by one of genuine service and respect. The changes weren't just cosmetic. Crime rates in Riverside had actually decreased as community relations improved and citizens became more willing to cooperate with police investigations. Officer morale, despite initial resistance to reform, had improved significantly as the department's reputation was restored and professional standards were elevated. Recruiting had become easier as the department attracted candidates who wanted to be part of positive change rather than perpetuate old problems. Sarah's transformation of the Riverside Police Department became a case study in police reform, studied in law enforcement academies and graduate programs across the country. She was invited to speak at conferences, consulted with other departments facing similar challenges, and recognized by national law enforcement organizations for her leadership and innovation. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the community itself. Citizen complaints, which had been among the highest in the state, dropped by 70%. Community satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvement in public trust and confidence in the police. Most importantly, the department began to attract and retain officers who saw law enforcement as a calling to serve rather than an opportunity to exercise power over others. Thompson's story, meanwhile, took a different trajectory. Prison was a humbling experience for someone who had been accustomed to wielding authority over others. His fellow inmates, many of whom had their own negative experiences with police, showed him little of the respect he'd grown accustomed to receiving. He was forced to confront the impact of his actions, not just on Sarah, but on the countless citizens who had suffered under his brand of policing over the years. During his community service, Thompson worked at a homeless shelter in the same neighborhood he'd once patrolled with suspicion and hostility. Slowly, gradually, he began to see the people he'd once dismissed as criminals or troublemakers as human beings with complex stories and legitimate struggles. It wasn't a dramatic conversion. People don't change overnight, but it was a beginning. When Thompson was released from jail, he faced a choice that would define the rest of his life: Several former colleagues offered him jobs in private security, positions where he could continue to exercise authority without the scrutiny that now came with public law enforcement. But Thompson chose a different path. He enrolled in social work classes at the local community college and eventually found work as a counselor in a program that helped ex-offenders reintegrate into society. Years later, Thompson would reflect on the moment when his fist connected with Sarah Williams's jaw as the worst and best thing that had ever happened to him. Worst because it destroyed the life he'd built on a foundation of prejudice and abuse of power. Best because it forced him to confront the kind of person he'd become and gave him the opportunity to become someone better. Sarah Williams continued to serve as Riverside's police chief for 8 years, transforming not just the department but the entire relationship between law enforcement and the community. When she finally retired, she left behind a legacy that extended far beyond any single case or incident. She had proven that change was possible, that leadership mattered, and that the courage to do what was right could overcome even the most entrenched resistance. Her story became more than just an account of one woman's triumph over prejudice and abuse of power. It became a blueprint for reform, a testament to the power of principle over politics, and a reminder that justice sometimes comes wearing civilian clothes and speaking softly, but it always carries a badge. The badge may be worn by someone who looks different than those who wore it before,